Hello and welcome to another edition of the FreeManCast. I am Josh Friedman, joined by Brent Sanders. How you doing, Brent?
Pretty good. It's a little bit warm here, but I'm doing okay.
It's very pleasant on a early September Saturday evening here in the park in Sofia, Bulgaria.
It's always pleasant. It's always more pleasant in the park, but it's still a little bit warm. I don't know. It's about 90, 95, something like that.
No, it's not. It's not that hot.
85?
85 probably. Somewhere around 30 Celsius. Where exactly are we, by the way?
Well, this is called Zaimov Park. It's the theater. There's the Sofia Theater is located about 100 meters down that way. So, small park. It's right in the center of Sofia.
Okay, let's get down to business. We are here to talk about none other than Dinko Yambol. Dinko from Yambol, the rather infamous refugee hunter from Bulgaria who we had the pleasure of meeting last weekend. Brent and I went out to Sunny Beach where we met and interviewed Dinko, and that's going to be the focus of this broadcast. We're going to be speaking about our encounters with Dinko, our impressions, what he was like to speak with, to hang out with, what he's like as a person, whether his story or stories have credibility, and we're going to wrap up with a little bit of a discussion on refugees in Bulgaria in general. So, going back to last weekend, we arrived in Sunny Beach. It was just about a week ago, Saturday evening last week. And very quickly, we met Dinko. What were your first impressions?
It's my first impressions were that he is like a man's man. That he's trying to, he's trying to impress the people around him by talking about his weapons, talking about his sports, his wrestling achievements in the past, etc., etc. So he reminded me a lot of certain, I'm going to say, mafia types, although not everybody who acts like that is mafia, but most of them are. So
Bulgarian mafia?
Yeah, the Bulgarian mafia, yeah. Just kind of very put offish, I guess is maybe a way to say it. Like he's not at all interested in charming us. I mean, what I mean is that he did everything that he could in his power to prove what a man he was, but he never ever tried to charm us or to be nice to us or to be especially friendly with us, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, which didn't come as a surprise to me, but I guess a lot of people, when confronted with a foreign news crew, they might be trying to put on some sort of rather charming front. As a reference point, we discussed this in a recent podcast in Sofia. Brent has been here for close to a few decades, more than 25 years, and in that podcast you were discussing a bit about back in the wild 1990s, how you had some run-ins in Bulgaria with some of the, I guess they were mafia guys.
Well, I've taught mafia bosses, or a boss, so I do know what I'm talking about. But back then in the 90s, it was rampant with small, well, I keep on forgetting the word, but like small-time mafia. And they were pretty much, I think it's been established that they were being paid for by what used to be the government, or what was the communist government, sort of. The communist government sort of, when communism fell in '89, they sort of took their funds and they gave them to certain people in the party that they liked or that they trusted to develop some sort of business or whatever. And of course those people then, it was a lawless period, so there were no police. I mean, there were police, but they didn't do anything. So it was just like basically the mafia guys were running the country, and we would go to bars or like nightclubs, listen to live music, and there were always incidents with those types of people, just acting very similar to the way that Dinko acted when we were there.
Getting back to Dinko, for those of you who are still not familiar, please take a look at the links in the description below, both the full video interview and a brief article on Freeman Post, as well as a vlog that the two of us filmed during our trip last weekend, both in Sunny Beach and in Neseber, the old town, very beautiful and pleasant old town by Sunny Beach. And in both those videos you can learn more about Dinko, especially the full interview with him. But still, for those of you who are not aware, Dinko basically rose to fame about a year and a half ago after he filmed a video in which he said he ran into some migrants or refugees or asylum seekers from the Middle East while he was riding his ATV, or maybe a motorbike. Stories changed a little bit, near the Bulgarian well, we'll get into that in a second. Oh, he was off-roading near the Bulgarian-Turkish border, and he said that these migrants attacked him, and then he wrestled them, tied them up, filmed them, and called the police. And that video footage spread all over the world, basically, and he became very famous in Bulgaria, and he, in a sense, became an international celebrity because the videos were picked up all over the international media, and he was interviewed in major publications and on major broadcast channels. Now we're going to dissect that story a little bit. There were certainly things that caused me to question him a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit. And Brent, first off, I'm going to ask you, what were your impressions about the story he told about his first encounters with the refugees and his credibility with regard to that?
Well, my immediate impression, and by the way, I had watched some of his interviews in preparation for our interview, but my immediate impression was that the story changed. So he's very inconsistent in his story. Sometimes he says that he was attacked by somebody carrying some metal object. Sometimes he says it was a wooden object. Sometimes, he changes the story about where they were from, and there are many, many inconsistencies.
Well, I would say on the issue of where they're from, at one point, probably later on with us, after he had said they're from Syria, or then maybe from Afghanistan, or then maybe from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, at one point he admitted that he doesn't know. And I don't think that's so much a point to harp on his credibility, because I would say in that situation most people wouldn't know whether they're coming from Syria, Iraq, or even Afghanistan.
Well, I doubt if they spoke English. Probably most of them didn't speak English, so how would he know where they were from?
Probably not. And if it indeed was the encounter that he described and there was a fight, then who knows what was going on. But he did say that he was attacked by a metal object and a wooden object. At first, he said that, I think with us, that he said that he was riding his off-roading vehicle, whatever it was, and that they tried to attack him with a wooden object, which was the first thing that stood out to me, because I've encountered so many of these asylum seekers who've crossed into Bulgaria, and most of them are incredibly scared of making that trip across the Turkish-Bulgarian border and into Bulgaria. There have been so many cases of refugees and asylum seekers coming out of that trip completely bruised and beaten and robbed, at least according to their accounts. But there have been so many of those accounts that there really is some credibility to that story, and it's been very widely reported. in the Bulgarian media and the international media, and I've interviewed a bunch of them. So,
Josh, can I ask a question?
Go
then
for it.
in this case, do you think that these people crossed the border after the incident with Dinko, or were they talking about the police brutality? Because there has been violence with the police.
The police brutality started months before the Dinko incident. I interviewed asylum seekers in Belgrade back in the October 2015, and I have video footage of them, face all bruised up, and a bunch of them saying they were beaten and robbed by Bulgarian police. And the Dinko incident occurred in spring or late winter of 2016. So it was 5, maybe 6 months after I had already encountered these people who were giving accounts of getting beaten, and it was already well into the media by then. The reason I raised that point is because of these dozens and dozens of asylum seekers I've met and interviewed who've crossed through Bulgaria. Almost all of them discuss that part of their journey with utter trepidation. They're very scared. Granted, there could be some terrorists coming in, and we'll get into that in a minute, but I wouldn't expect some random Afghan or Syrian or Iraqi migrant to come across that border and have the nerve to attack a big, bulky man riding a motorbike.
On a 4x4. By the way, I think I do want to put this out as a disclaimer. I think that a lot of the confusion does come from the fact that he didn't speak English that well. So I noticed this specifically in this case when he was saying my motorbike, and then it's because he didn't know that we call them 4x4s or whatever. So
well, we've seen photos of him on a 4x4, but he's got all kinds of equipment, so we don't know for sure what he was riding that day.
No, I just get the impression that he meant the 4x4, but he was saying motorbike because he didn't know the proper terminology. So
I'll defer to you on that, being that you're the linguist here.
that's one thing. I think that he is, his English does cause some confusion, but that does not change the fact that his story changed. Because, he told us the story, and he's told stories in Bulgarian, the same story, or a similar story, to many other Bulgarian outlets, let's say. And it seems to me that in every case, the story changes.
I was getting that impression too. Not huge changes, but a bunch of small changes. And
exactly the types of changes that would happen if somebody is making up a story.
I should point out right now that basically what we're holding a podcast, but part of new media has become process journalism. And in a sense, that's what's going on here right now. Rather than waiting to come out with some investigative report like might have been done traditionally, we're giving you our insights and impressions and where we are in this process of us getting to know him and interviewing him and maybe reporting on him. And as a journalist, as someone who's interviewed lots of people with all kinds of, with a whole range of credibility, when I start seeing or hearing a bunch of little changes to a story, alarms start going off in my head. That's not something I'm looking for in a credible source.
Well, it's the same thing that an investigative policeman would do. They would be looking for inconsistencies in stories. That's always a problem in testimonies, etc. So I think that, anytime you have inconsistencies in stories, especially if this is something that he supposedly lived through and he can't get the details straight, then that always sets off an alarm. Yes, like you said, it's suspect.
Something else that he was quick to point out, which we actually did not discuss in the interview or on camera, it was the scars on his arms. This we discussed in an off-camera interview that we did, and he showed us that how on one arm he has a long scar on his forearm, and then on the other arm, right around there, and his other arm's got a smaller scar, but a very noticeable scar on his bicep. And we do have, I believe, a photo of the bicep scar, and we'll try to crop that in. Now, what he told us is that those scars came from the very incident in which he was attacked, and then he wrestled them and filmed them, and he's saying that those scars came from the incident that created all of this. What were your impressions on that?
Well, I mentioned to you earlier before we started the podcast that it seemed very strange to me that the scar that he had on his arm, he has tattoos, and the scar that he had on his arm was very, very thin and very, very clean, as if it had been cut by a knife. But it seems like if he were attacked, first, I don't know how it would have gone like that. But if it did, I would suspect that there were it would be more jagged. It wouldn't be just like this clean medical, surgical incision.
Yeah, you know what? It kind of did resemble a scar you'd get from a surgery.
Yeah, it did very much.
This is all speculation right now. We don't have any hard evidence, and we didn't even question him about it. And frankly, I don't think it's that important, but so many people in Bulgaria are so fascinated or frustrated by this story of Dinko's encounter with the refugees and everything that came out of it. So it's very interesting to question it and speculate a little bit.
Well, I agree. I don't know what to add here.
I don't know whether he whether he got those scars from... I have no idea what he got those scars from, to put it bluntly. But I would think that if he was attacked by some wooden object in some sort of brawl, or a metal object in some sort of brawl, it wouldn't leave a precision scar like that.
Said that he was attacked by a knife, and I'm sure he knows that word. So he never said that.
Which, by the way, let me interject really quickly. His English, as you could see in the interview, it's decent. It's solid. He said he spent 4 years in London, so maybe that'll give you some context.
Yeah. I don't know what are you asking me a question?
No, I'm just pointing that out to the audience in terms of how much his English skills or lack thereof might have factored into this confusion.
Yeah, I think that his vocabulary is pretty good. His grammar really is crap, and but I mean he gets most of his words correct. So I compared him to Hristos Stoichkov, who is a famous footballer here from Bulgaria, and he has a famous interview where he's speaking in English and he's talking about the match, and he says sometime win, sometime lun. And that's about the same level. I mean, you get some words that are correct and then others that are clearly not correct, but you can basically understand the overall idea.
Well, he's very understandable. I'm not going to harp on his English. Something else that came up off camera that was very interesting was during our discussion with him about both his procurement of military equipment and his relations with the Bulgarian government. And off camera, he told us that he does have some sort of relationship with the Bulgarian government. Do you want to get into this?
Sure. I asked, I think you asked him if he got money from the government, and he said yes. And then I asked him from which ministry, which department, and he said, I can't tell you. So that makes it sound sort of like he's a spy for the government. I don't know. I mean, he is obviously working. He says some people in the government support him and love him, and other people do not. But he did say that he was getting funding from the Bulgarian government. So.
I'm actually forgetting. Did he specifically say he was getting funding, or is it possibly equipment, or did we? I'm forgetting.
I think that you asked him whether he got funding from the government. So yes, whether he got money from the government.
He definitely told us that he got something from the government, and then I remember you asked him which ministry, and he wouldn't say.
Well, he said I can't. He said I can't tell you.
Which,
like it's a secret. So.
which, that answer is kind of indicative of someone who does have some sort of deal going with the government. I mean, that's the impression I got from him. Obviously, we could question his credibility and his honesty on everything, but the impression I got from the conversation is that, yeah, he is getting something from the government, and he made it very clear how much he likes Bulgarian Prime Minister Boyko Borisov, and off camera what was he saying about Boyko?
I don't remember the details. I mean, he just basically said he's the perfect man for the job in Bulgaria. He's the best man, and he loves him and supports him, and he had nothing negative to say about Borisov. I mean, obviously he was talking about Merkel, and he said she's a stupid woman. He doesn't like her.
He said those things on camera.
Yes, the second part. But I personally don't see Merkel and Borisov as diametrically opposed. I think that he just looks up to Borisov because Borisov is a kind of mafia figure himself. And my own mafia boss had dealings with him during the elections.
Really quickly, for those outside of Bulgaria, can you very quickly explain Boyko and his past?
Okay, he became
communist times.
He became famous as Todor Zhivkov, who is the communist dictator here, as his bodyguard, and he's in many, many, many pictures with Todor Zhivkov. So that's where he came from. But because he was on the inside, he's been sort of, used by different political groups, this and that, and eventually he became the head of the Department of the Interior, which is like, the head of the police, and then he became Prime Minister.
He's been Prime Minister 3 times now, so he's reached the top of Bulgarian politics, but he's got this very similar physique as Dinko, and they both. Boyko was a wrestler, right?
I'm not sure about that, but probably I wouldn't.
But there was this whole clique, right, of wrestlers in Bulgaria who became influential.
When I talk about the mafia in the 90s, or the thugs of the mafia, because the thugs, they came from the wrestlers. So in Bulgaria, if you say borets, bortsi, it's almost, which means wrestler or wrestlers, it's almost the same as saying mafia person, because Bulgaria was very famous back then for having good wrestlers at the Olympics, etc., etc. So they have always prided themselves on the sort of like wrestling and the boxing sort of arena. And so back then in the 90s, all of those guys were working for the mafia. And they were paid by the mafia, they were given nice cars by the mafia, etc. And they were just told, do whatever you want. If you want to bully somebody, if you want to, they wanted to terrorize society, and they did a fairly good job of it, I would say. But they were wrestlers, yes, most of them. Some boxers, etc.
Let's talk a little bit about the larger picture, maybe get into a little bit about the ethics of the migrant hunting and what's been going on with Dinko and others at the border. So I don't have resentment towards Dinko. I'm appreciative he did the interview. I very much enjoyed meeting him and seeing who he is and trying to get a feel for what he's about, and I do very much see now why he's such a polarizing figure in Bulgaria. And on one side of that is there are a lot of people in Bulgaria who do not want refugees here. And to a lot of people within that faction, his efforts and others to go to the border and attempt to round up migrants or keep them out, to a lot of people in that faction, those efforts have been heroic.
He is sort of worshipped by, I don't know, I think it's about 50-50, but I think generally speaking, if you're talking about more educated people, they tend to dislike him. But there's that macho sort of, there's that macho, the Balkan macho thing which is going on here, and he acts like that. A lot of guys like the macho sort of behavior, and so I think a lot of them like him just because of that, because he's sort of the macho guy. But then a lot of people support him. I think that the people who don't support him, it's not because of his actions with the immigrants, it's because he's stupid, or they think he's stupid. They would say he's stupid. So it's not so much because of his actions with the immigrants, it's just his behavior.
I got the impression from talking with some people and reading some people's comments that I could even draw a parallel to the US. There were several people referring to him as a hillbilly, and it kind of reminded me of this city versus rural America divide. And part of it is, yeah, so-called educated folks in the city, and it seemed like a lot of those types here in Bulgaria, no matter what their view of what their view of the immigration issue is, that they're quite resentful toward him as this person who's just this stereotypical macho dude from this rural place, this town called Yambol.
Right. I mean, I want you to think like, I don't know how most people would react if somebody says, I want something, I take it. I want you, I use you. He told you
that to me in the interview.
Which is absolute, but he was being absolutely honest there. He means exactly, if I cannot get use out of you, then I'm not going to give you an interview. And so he was doing it specifically to promote himself and his policies or his ideas. I think probably mostly himself, but
well, I don't know his motives. I can't speak to his intentions, but he certainly does seem to like publicity. On the wider issue of the refugees, we discussed this a fair amount actually in the podcast we did a year and a half ago after our trip to Idomeni, which was right around the same time of when the Dinko issue was occurring. Can you speak a little bit to the general sentiments in Bulgaria toward the refugees and some of the reasoning behind that?
well, it's hard to say. I mean, you do have the left-wing faction who are just going to say we support the refugees because there's these poor people who have been chased out of their country and they are only coming here because they're going to be killed or whatever, and we have to protect them. Sort of like the Merkel point of view. So a lot of people are going to be pro-immigrant in that sense. The anti-immigrant issue has a lot to do, or that sentiment from a lot of Bulgarians, of course, has to do with the fact that, well, Bulgaria was under the Turkish yoke, the Ottoman Empire for 500 years, and so there is naturally a sort of negative feeling towards Muslims because they're Christian, or they're Orthodox Christian, and they see Islam as a threat to their way of life, and also they're thinking about it historically. They don't like the Turks in general because the Turks were here, and then anybody else from the Middle East, in general, they're not going to like them. But this is all prejudice. Now, there are many people who understand very well, as you and I do, I think. Maybe you disagree, but I think that we understand that the main problem with the immigrants is not exactly religion. It's more, it has to do with terrorist attacks, and it has to do with whether or not they are willing to integrate into European society and to become productive members of that society. And there are a lot of people who understand this, and so many people are just intellectually, let's say logically, they don't like the idea of Merkel. I don't like it either. Merkel saying to the immigrants that, hey, come here, we'll protect you, we'll give you shelter, etc. So there's the whole range. I think you could expect the same thing on any major issue in any country. You're going to have people on all sides with different reasoning. Some of them are very emotional, some of them are just prejudiced, some of them are thinking logically.
My impression from traveling to all these different countries throughout the refugee crisis is that Bulgaria as a country has more negative sentiments towards the refugees than almost all of the other neighboring countries. Maybe with the exception of Hungary, but I don't find many countries where the people in general, many countries here in Europe where the people in general have more negative sentiments towards the refugees. And I do think it's because all of these reasons that you just listed off. And
they're on the edge of Europe. They are the crossroad to the Middle East. So, either they come through Bulgaria, they come through Greece, or they come through Albania, let's say, through Greece, Albania, and up then Italy, etc. But if they're coming from the middle...
Well, there are all these routes. They're coming from Africa to Italy. There are a whole bunch of routes.
So, but Bulgaria is historically on the edge of Europe, and it's the crossroads of Europe and Asia. So it's normal that they would have a stronger opinion about it too. If you're up in, I don't know where in Germany, that's several hundred miles distant from any Muslim country. Bulgaria borders a Muslim country.
I think the point you raised about the Ottoman times not being lost on people's mind is a very valid point. I would say here a lot of people view foreign Muslims with very high skepticism. The notion that there is a 10% Turkish and basically Muslim minority in Bulgaria, which we haven't really gotten into, but from what I've come across, people here tend to be highly skeptical of Muslims coming into the country who look unfamiliar and foreign.
There's always an element of people who will hate any foreigners, but if you have a different color of skin, it sort of amps up the problem, doesn't it? Skin color, different language, different religion. So, they're a lot more tolerant of Western Europeans, and even Dinko himself said that. He says, I don't want the Muslims here. It's fine because we are both actually immigrants to Bulgaria in a sense. I am for sure. You're at least a temporary immigrant, but he didn't seem to have such a problem with us. Of course, it was just the Islamic.
Well, he said and this was one of the things that people are probably noticing the most, and I brought it up in the write-up on the interview, that he made a comment suggesting that 50% of Muslim immigrants or the asylum seekers coming into Bulgaria are potential terrorists. He made that comment in our interview with him.
Yes.
What would be your response to that comment?
Well, I think his number
what are your
is a little bit high. I don't think it's 50% by any rate, but even 2% is a problem, because one terrorist can take out 20, 200, 500, 3,000 people. I mean, theoretically. So it's not I don't know about the percentage. I think that 50% is way high. But I would say there's probably a good 2 or 3%, 5% maybe, that are potential terrorists, and that's a big enough problem.
I couldn't put a percentage on it, but from what we've seen in neighboring states in the Balkans in recent years, as well as what has been happening in some of these immigrant communities like in Belgium and elsewhere, there's a high chance that there will be people coming into Europe who do not arrive as terrorists or even Islamists, but they get radicalized once they're here, and they find life to be not the dream that they were expecting.
I don't really know so much about that. I can say that I have watched many videos and interviews with different mullahs across Europe and across the Middle East, who are saying, you know, that the future of Europe is Islamic because the whites don't have enough children, and we're going to, they say basically like the immigrants, they are encouraging the immigrants to have very large families, and even in some cases I've heard them encouraging Muslims to rape European women so that they have half Muslim or half, let's say, Middle Eastern children, and that the future of Europe will not be Christian, not be what we're used to for the past several millennia, but a Muslim region. So that's part of the problem. I've also seen like videos of people going through certain parts of London that are primarily Muslim in population, and the Muslims come out and they say, this is not your England, this is our England, and they are very radicalized. And I don't know if that happens. It seems like a lot of those people probably grow up in Europe, and yet they have those extreme feelings or those extremist sentiments. So I'm sure that there is some radicalization going on after they arrive. I just don't know what percentage.
To start wrapping things up, the interview of Dinko was by no means an endorsement of him or what he was saying. Like I said earlier, I was very much interested in meeting him and finding out about him, but at the same time, I want to cover multiple sides of this refugee crisis. And earlier in the week prior to interviewing Dinko, I was interviewing a refugee and giving him all kinds of time on camera, just as I've done with many refugees in the past. And I do want to get both sides, or what I think would be more accurate to say, a whole spectrum of sides that exist in this refugee crisis. And now, having spoken with Dinko, I think a lot of the threats that he discusses are exaggerated, and I do think that he is very much interested in publicity, and he is interested in fame and fortune and possibly power. But at the same time, some of the threats that he is discussing are legitimate, and that's been shown by terror attacks and other problems that have been happening over the past couple of years. Brent,
one other thing. Whether they're terrorists or not, in my opinion, does not make it right for them to cross the border illegally. So if they're illegal immigrants, that's bad enough, and whether they're terrorists,
well, hold on. I mean, we're opening a whole can of worms here, but
say that at the end. I mean, he does have
okay, but under the asylum rules, they're allowed to come in and ask for asylum. They're not technically allowed to come in and then walk across Europe and go live in Germany, but they are allowed to come into Bulgaria as an irregular migrant, which is the government term, and ask for asylum.
that anybody is allowed, or it's okay for them to cross the border without having some sort of being vetted, or the government in some sort of way deciding who gets to come into Bulgaria and who doesn't?
I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that's the case under EU and international rules.
Wow. So are you saying that the wall that they built, the fence that they built on the border a few years ago is illegal, or what?
No, because they can do like what they do in Hungary and put a gate in the fence and let people in to apply for asylum.
Okay.
But let's not get into all of that right now. Let's try to wrap things up. I gave my final thoughts. I'd like to hear your final thoughts on Dinko and the refugees here in general.
Well, on Dinko, I would say that I actually do agree with a lot of the things that he says, and so I don't really have anything against his belief system. I don't think he's the most pleasant person, but that could just be a personal issue. About the immigrants, I think that we have discussed this before. I just basically think that, well, it's okay to have immigrants if we know that they are not radicalized. I mean, I think that they should be vetted, and I do not think that we should just, or that Merkel or anybody else should just invite people from dozens of countries and say, we will shelter you, we will give you welfare, etc., etc. I mean, that's just asking for trouble, because a lot of the immigrants are not going to be coming from war-torn countries. They're going to say that they are discriminated against, but that just basically means that they're not rich in their home country, they don't have a good job or whatever. And a lot of those immigrants are what do you call economic immigrants. And
we discussed that at length in a recent podcast. Check out the podcast we did on Macedonia, fake news, and where the refugees came from. I can throw a link to that in the description below. Please, we'd like to hear from you. What are your comments on Bulgaria, the refugees, and Dinko? Go ahead and leave them in the comments stream underneath this video or on the Freeman Post website or Facebook page. We'd like to hear your opinion. We've already heard from several people on the matter. And if you liked this video, please leave it a like on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. And Brent, 20 seconds to wrap up.
I don't have anything else to say. Thank you very much for, if you're still with us, and hang loose.
All right. Thanks for watching. Ciao.